I'd like to call to order the meeting of the Budget and Finance Committee Thursday, September 16th. And our next order of business is approval of the August 19 committee minutes.
Move for approval.
Second.
Any comments? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The consideration of the 2009-2010 year-end budget amendment ordinance is the next item, and that is the one where we're getting everything straightened out at the end of the year.
This is essentially our cleanup ordinance for budget amendments for the 2009-2010 fiscal year. And this just goes through and cleans those up. I will note our preliminary near final numbers on the general fund show us underspending our budget in the general fund by about $3.4 million, so somewhere in that neighborhood. Again, that is still being finalized, but we think those numbers are going to be pretty close to the final place that we end up, and that's a testament to the good work that our departments all did in controlling expenditures, something we needed to do because revenue fell short by a similar amount. We ended up almost exactly where we thought we would in terms of the year, and if you look at the budget that we had in the year, we had a planned use of reserves of approximately $3 million, $2 million of which was one-time additional contribution to the pension program, and so all of that factored in. That's essentially where we've ended up, or appear to be ending up with the fiscal year, as we're doing the final closeouts there.
So this,
We're that close?
no, I was going to say, though, this is underspending an operating, or can we say,
Yes.
or less?
Yes.
So it's really, we'll still be having to take the money from reserve.
We're still going to draw on reserves, but in an amount similar to what we had planned on originally when we built the budget. And these amendments don't necessarily reflect that underspending.
Right.
It just sort of cleans up the under and over, or especially the over areas where we're over, and cleans that up overall.
So the budget's still $50 million?
Yes, yeah. You're going to come in right around that expenditure level, and that's also what your existing budget, where that's tracking as well.
And
What amount did we agree on in that reserve, drawing on the reserve?
For the pension? Well,
Overall.
the pension alone was $2 million, and it was $1.1 million, if I remember right,
You're right at about $1 million, yeah. So
for capital items.
Okay.
you've hit that almost exactly here with the way this came out, and it's from underspending, and unfortunately the revenue overall underperformed. So we ended up about the same place.
so how much will this leave us in the reserve fund?
Projects out around 24, 25 million.
It's between, I believe it's between 25 and 26 million.
Okay. So we're going to be over 50% when compared to the existing budget that you've adopted for fiscal year 2011. You've got a reserve that is in excess of 50% right now heading in. If you remember, that budget includes a planned use of reserves of around $660,000. So significantly less in that area, and again, targeted at capital expenditures. So our ongoing expenses, our ongoing revenue and expenditures are in sync. We've just targeted a portion of our reserves to help us pay for some capital costs.
Good.
Any other comments about this? Is there, do we need to,
Move approval.
I was going to say, do we recommend this
If
to
you'll move
the?
this on,
Yes.
we'll take it to first reading at the next board meeting.
Move approval.
Second.
Any other discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Then item 4 is the consideration of a letter of engagement with PFM Asset Management for swap valuation service.
Let me take that one if I may. There's a new rule it's not new, but it's effective this year with the Government Accounting Standards Board, where if we have any swap agreements that we're using to hedge variable rate debt, we have to now report that on a monthly basis, and we have to report valuations from an independent third party. Typically, we have gotten one of the banks to do that, and it's typically been the bank that has been providing the letter of credit either for the swap or for the variable rate. And the state of Tennessee has said essentially, you've got to have a contract with a third-party provider. So in light of that, we went out and took bids. The state set out several names of third parties that they knew of that would do this. And ironically, our financial advisor, Public Financial Management, has a division that does this and provides this service. They had the lowest price of 81 that we got quotes from. One other issue with their particular version of this is instead of just sending you the valuation, they basically give you a computer tool that you can go on night or day, any day of the month, and determine what the valuations are. So in essence, it gives us access to their database. It is a cost of $2,300 a year. We will be bringing it to you to go ahead and do that. Even though it's a small amount, I wanted to make sure that you were aware of that because it does add a little bit of cost to the debt that we have and the way that we handle that. But because of the accounting rules, we really have no choice but to go forward with this.
Well, help me understand what happens if the valuation does not equal what we value it as. Does that mean we have to take out a larger letter of credit, or we have to back it up with, or it's just a reporting measure?
It's really just a reporting measure. At this point in time, if you have a swap that is truly intended to hedge, and there are some definitions that you have to meet to qualify that, we really only disclose this in the footnotes of our audit report, the fact that this does move with interest rates. And in some cases, when you have interest rates as low as they are right now, we actually have a negative valuation on these swaps. If interest rates had gone the other way and went through the roof, we'd have a very, very positive valuation on it. We really don't care per se on a day-to-day basis what the valuation is, because the purpose of the swap is to hedge. It's to lock in an interest rate behind this variable rate piece that we have. And it gets a little bit complicated in how you look at that, but this is for reporting purposes only.
Gotcha. Move approval.
Well,
I'm
is there a
sorry.
second? Okay, I have some questions too.
Sure.
Which ones does this affect? I mean, when you're talking about a swap, where is that showing up on our sheet? And, as I say, I didn't learn until very recently that a derivative, that all of our variable rates were actually part of the derivative column.
Well, derivative can be defined in a lot of different ways.
Indeed. They're hedges. They are hedges.
I think most of the derivatives, just a sidebar, most of the derivatives that you've heard of in the press are credit default swaps. And they are, you almost need a bookie to buy one of those. I mean, these are really almost instruments of gambling that some investors have used to hedge against default by big corporations. And they've taken very strong positions. The state does not really allow us to do that, but what they do allow us to do, if you have people who have gone through the training and the education, is allow us to do what they call a synthetic fixed rate. And the purpose of doing that was really to take advantage of the market when the taxable rates and the tax-exempt rates were almost layered on top of each other. In other words, there was no benefit to having the tax exemption. So, but people would buy taxable rates that were very close to that, and you could actually create, by having variable rate debt and then a fixed rate alternate, a hedge to that, you could come in with the equivalent of a fixed rate that was substantially less than traditional fixed rate. If it was very close in difference, no one would have taken advantage of those derivatives, those hedges. And again, the name for those are interest rate swaps. Interest rate swaps have been around for a long, long time. I can give you plenty of information on those. They've been used by banks and financial companies for years and years and years. They really didn't become popular in the municipal world until the 90s, when again, the difference between taxable interest rates and tax-exempt interest rates almost layered on top of each other. And we're actually at a point very similar to that right now in certain parts of the yield curve. If you go to 15 years and beyond, in some cases, you actually pay more for a tax-exempt bond from a municipality than you would from a treasury bill of the same maturity.
But okay, but whenever you're saying that this was popular, right now though, with the financial economy the way it is, and I don't mean just Franklin or just municipal bonds, is there an advantage to having all this variable rate that we have? Well, all this synthetic fixed rate I see right here. So, really, I'm asking because, the financial world has changed in the last 2 years.
Well,
Or three.
I would ask you to step back and look at our debt portfolio, and that's really, when the state looks at us, they talk about our debt portfolio. We tried to build a portfolio of debt in the same way that you would build a portfolio of investments. We did not want to put all of our eggs in one basket. So Lauren's going to talk to you, Lauren from PFM is going to talk to you in just a minute about where we stand as far as our variable rate debt, our synthetic fixed debt, and our true fixed interest rate debt, and what the proportions are. So we'll get into that. I would point out that we only have 2 swaps out of 13 or 14 different debt issues. One of them is a very small one that we used through SunTrust Bank to purchase the Battlefield property and to pay for some additional charges, additional right-of-way cost on McEwen interchange that came about. The other one is the building authority issue that we used to pay for part of the police station.
The Franklin, that's the ones, the Franklin Building Authority.
Right. Those are the only 2 synthetic fixed ones that we have. And all that means is you've got a variable rate issue that has a hedge with it, that has an interest rate swap that in essence converts the variable rate to a fixed rate.
Say that last sentence again.
The interest rate swap basically converts the variable rate to a fixed rate.
It kicks in if there's an issue, is what you're saying.
Well, what it does is it pays the variable rate and charges you a fixed rate instead. You issue variable rate debt, and the interest rates go up and down, and the payments go up and down. Then you also have a swap, and the swap means we'll pay you the variable rate if you'll pay us the fixed rate. And that's the side that the banks take. So we end up with the equivalent of a fixed rate.
Okay, so, and I have no idea what LIBOR is now. I mean, I've looked at it sometimes, even in the last year, but 63% of the 5-year LIBOR, what is that looking like right now?
It's very low, like all other interest rates.
That's what I thought. But the 3.59 is not that low, right now?
Well, it's not that low. It's lower than the traditional average 20-year municipal bond.
I'm saying right now.
But again, you pay your money and take your choice.
Right.
At the time that we did that, interest rates were in the 4% range. And to be able to lock that in over a 20-year period at roughly 350, based on all the advice that we had, looked like a very good opportunity for us to save some interest. And if we held that to maturity for another, whatever it is, 14, 15 years, we might end up very much on the strong side of that. That's what I'm saying when we come back to valuation of these swaps. The purpose of this is to disclose to everyone how this ebbs and flows, but the purpose of the swap is to hedge it over 20 years.
Yeah. Well, true.
It's not to swap and hope the rates go up so that you
That's
can
right.
cash it out.
That's right.
But you still have to recognize the fact that there's a value if rates go up. And we're now showing that there's a disadvantage when rates go down.
Yeah.
But I think we all know rates are not going to stay where they are forever. They could stay that way for a long, long time. No one really knows. But our purpose when we look at issuing this debt, and maybe when we talk to Lauren, she can support this a little bit, is again to make sure that we don't have everything in fixed rate, we don't have everything in variable rate. We have a mixture of that, because if we had everything in fixed, if we had done everything in 2004, 5, and 6 in fixed rates, we'd be paying 5% on everything. You know, last month on the Tennessee Bond Fund variable rate, we paid 0.4%. On the issue with the 10 loans program that we're about to refund, we're only paying 0.6%. And we're getting ready to convert that to a fixed rate that's roughly 2.5%. Well, that sounds foolish, except that there's 12 to 14 years left on that, and the rates are not going to stay at 0.6
Right,
forever.
right.
So while the rates are low, we're trying to dip into the fixed rate market and take advantage of that. The other issue I would say, thing to remember, is that we started out with 20-year loans. They're now down to 14. So the highest cost is in those end maturities, the 15th through the 20th year. So now that we only have to refund 14 years, we're going to get a much lower rate, even if the yield curve looked the same as it did 6 years ago. Because we've slid down the yield curve and we have maturities that are going to pay off more quickly.
But really, until fairly recently, we really haven't had much fixed rate. We've had a lot of variable rate. Just looking at this from what I'm seeing here, you know, just on this thing I guess we'll be talking about here, it looks like we had almost all variable rate.
Well, most of the debt up until, say, 2000 was in the water and sewer department, and that was all fixed rate. So I would say it's really almost the opposite. It's really in 2002 with the construction of Century Court. That was the first bond fund loan that I noticed here. And then in 2004, 5, and 6 is when we started adding to the variable rate. And again, the purpose of that is we had mostly fixed rate, and we were trying to diversify.
Okay, well, so let's see, I think we have a motion to,
Yep, seconded already.
okay. Any other comments?
Let's
Okay.
vote.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. And now we're ready for our debt strategy and annual review of debt policy. So I guess we've already started.
Got a little bit of a
on that.
jump start.
Look at that.
And we've got Lauren on the screen. Can you hear us okay, Lauren?
Aaron, I can hear you very well. I'm not sure if I'll be able to hear everyone else as well. So I
Maybe
have
we
to
should
get
use
some
these.
favors as we go through this new technology. People can certainly interrupt me if you, first of all, can't understand or if the screen freezes or anything like that. Also, if you have to repeat yourself, I apologize. Are y'all ready?
It may be that talking on these helps.
Can you hear, Lauren?
She's hearing
I can hear you.
She's going through the phone. Yeah. Yeah.
From that, okay.
I'm dizzy from watching the lag.
You'll watch the lag too, but
Okay, so how do we?
I think, Lauren, you're ready to go, and we'll try to follow the presentation here too on the larger screens
Okay, good.
in the room as well. So
Might be better.
Okay, I'm going to flip to it on my screen as well. I think it'll move just about in time from your end as well, but if not, certainly let me know. Y'all's conversation was very timely and gave me a nice introduction. And in fact, that is in fact the discussion that Russ has had with PSM and myself specifically, and Ryan Charles, which you all had the chance of meeting at the last Finance Committee I attended. So with that being said, we have worked with Russ and just spent some time digging into the existing debt portfolio of the city. We looked at general obligation debt as well as water and sewer debt. We looked at them separately. We did tend to focus on the general obligation debt since it's the larger component of the city's debt portfolio. On slide 2, this is a screenshot that summarizes all of the city's outstanding general obligation debt. This was as of August 24th, 2010. So it encompassed all the deals that we have recently worked on with y'all, the end of 2009, the new money transactions, as well as the deal that we worked on earlier this year for the recovery zone. So what this table lays out for you is the series name, or how we've referred to them kind of for internal purposes and trying to keep track of certain series of bonds, as well as the interest rate mode. You'll see a variable rate indication, a fixed rate, or as the discussion was earlier, a synthetic fixed rate, which are any series of bonds that have a hedge associated with them. The issuer pays, issuer receives is a summary of if it's a variable rate transaction, it notes that. If it's a locked-in fixed rate, kind of the range of where the interest rates are. Or in the case of the swaps or the hedges, it actually denotes kind of what the issuer pays and what you're receiving on the other side from your counterparty. We've included the delivery date and the final maturity of the bonds, as well as the outstanding par as of August 24th, 2010. The next call date, the variable rate bonds that the city has outstanding it's typical for a variable rate transaction to be currently callable at any time. So you'll see those will be noted as currently callable. And then the credit enhancement liquidity provider denotes who is the credit provider if you have a variable rate transaction, or the letter of credit provider, whichever one you have for a variable rate transaction, or for the synthetic fixed rates, who the counterparty is for those swaps. And those are the SunTrust and the debt fund names kind of towards the middle of the table that we've prepared. Now, the at-risk issues, I certainly don't want to cause any, alarm to anyone. However, that is the point of this process, is to walk through the city's existing debt portfolio and kind of earmark areas that we want to focus on, and if there's an opportunity to reduce risk or generate any savings, that we're taking advantage of those when it's probably in an environment where you're not feeling the pressure to do it immediately. So when all your debt is healthy and acting accordingly, it's a lot easier to make a rational decision as opposed to a knee-jerk reaction when you're sitting in a situation where your interest rates have moved upward and you're feeling the pressure. Therefore, those risks will be tied to a later chart that I will talk about, and you can kind of see what those risks are and what we view as a consideration when having these types of bonds outstanding. If you notice, the Series 2004 bonds have an asterisk associated with them. Those are the bonds that are advance refundable right now, and they right now produce savings. I believe that was part of the resolution that the board saw on Tuesday night. That those savings right now, there's about $6.8 million outstanding, and right now it looks like it produces about a present value savings of $350,000 to refund those bonds in the current interest rate environment. On slide 3, we have done the same type of analysis for the city's water and sewer debt. Most of this portfolio is fixed rate, with the exception of there's a variable rate loan that was issued in 2008. But this table reports the same information that we reported for the general obligation debt on the previous slide. Are there any questions?
The only question I have is concerning the savings you mentioned on the 2004 series that has the asterisks. Is that on that? Tell me how you got to the savings, how you calculated that, just so I understand.
That assumes that the interest rates that the city has locked in for those 2004 bonds, assuming you refinance all of the callable maturities right now in the current interest rate environment, you would be able to lock in an interest rate lower than what they are at now to produce a present value savings of approximately $350,000.
And that difference in the interest rate times what the principal is giving you that number.
That's correct, and it also takes into consideration any cost associated with doing a new transaction. So it's net of any cost associated.
But now, that's not the only one that we voted to proceed with
Refund.
reissuing bonds. What about that B1, the 2000, that also 2004?
That is correct, Alderman Pearson. We're going to be moving forward, and I will show you how we got to the selection of that particular series of bonds. On slide 4, this actually just provides a bar chart and shows the actual debt service for the city's general obligation bonds. The blue lines represent the principal component of the GO debt. The red lines represent the interest component. And then we have, for disclosure, included what we've assumed for the variable rate assumptions. We've been fairly conservative on any of the variable rate debt. We've assumed a little bit, obviously the rates have been very, very attractive. So those who are not associated with a hedge, we've assumed an interest rate assumption that's included in the box on the right-hand side. This also includes the 2 transactions that we've worked on recently, one of which was the Build America bonds that include a 35% subsidy for your interest cost, and the Recovery Zone bonds, which we did earlier this year, that included a 45% interest subsidy. This particular chart nets out that subsidy, so at the end of the day, it's the actual cost to the city after receipt of the subsidy payments for both of those programs.
So one was Build America bonds, and what was the other one? What was 45, did you say?
The Recovery Zone bonds were for 45% interest. 45% of your interest is subsidized by the federal government.
Okay.
For the life of the bonds. On slide 5, we've done the same type of chart, which includes the principal and interest component for the water and sewer debt, with a 1 interest rate assumption for the 1 variable rate piece that is for water and sewer debt, and the interest rate we've assumed for this chart, for this purposes, is 4.5%. There were no Recovery Zone or Build America bonds bonds issued through those programs for water and sewer projects, so there's no subsidized interest included in this chart. This future risk matrix, which is included on page 6, is probably where I think that it probably warrants a further explanation. I want to walk through kind of what we see as a risk, and maybe risk is not always the best word, but it's under full disclosure, it's what I've used here, and maybe consideration would also be an appropriate term. Market interest rates, that consideration or risk is obviously that the market is ever evolving, and every day it changes, and you or I know where interest rates are going to go. So there's certain vehicles that you can finance through that are subject to volatility in the market and where interest rates are going to go. Obviously, if you lock in an interest rate today, you're not subject to where the market moves tomorrow or 2 weeks from now or 2 years from now.
So this chart shows on the left-hand side the various different vehicles you can use. We don't have all of these. These are just ones that you can look at, and the checks sort of show some of the different types of risks you're exposed to as you work your way across. So
that's correct. These are not something that we actually went through and considered for the city. I just wanted to outline kind of the vehicles that we see that are prominent and still used in the market, with the exception of auction rate securities, which are not being used. They're not a vehicle that everyone has pretty much gotten out of that. The city did not have any exposure to those and will not be getting into that because it primarily just doesn't work. The subsidy loss or reduction is the conversation I was having earlier about the graphic that shows the BADs and the recovery zones, and that you get a 45% or 35% subsidy. I will tell you, I think I got a little check mark happy. They should not be checked under SISMA or percentage of LIBOR, the synthetic fixed rate obligations, the hedges. I apologize for that, I will correct it. The only vehicle that is applicable to is the recovery zones or the Build America bonds. While we think that is a very, very, very minimal risk, it obviously is a consideration and is part of that program. That would be if the program went away altogether, which I do not think is likely, or the rare chance that, you know, an issuer has their payment that comes from the federal government reduced for some tax obligation that they owe. We do not see this happening often, and it's usually with a big, very large issuer like a state level issuer for that to be a real consideration. Basis risk is associated purely with a swap or a hedge, and when Russ was describing a swap earlier, a swap works where you lock in a fixed rate. However, you are selling variable rate to your bondholders and receiving a variable rate from the counterparty or the bank involved in the swap. The basis risk is the disconnect between those two variable rate arms. So the issuer receives a variable rate and in turn is paying a variable rate to the bondholders. If those in fact aren't in sync and there's a slight difference between the two, that is called a basis risk. In a healthy market, that basis risk is very minimal and to be a nominal factor in considering a hedge. Tax law change obviously would affect that if there's any changes to the tax law and any debt that you have outstanding that's in a variable rate mode that you would need to convert to a fixed rate or you have market risk, you're obviously subject to any changes in the tax law. Liquidity renewal. This is associated with variable rate debt. One component that is required as part of a variable rate transaction is that any issuer has to have a liquidity provider, meaning that in the event the bonds don't get remarketed out into the variable rate environment, that the bondholders can immediately get their principal back or their money back, and that's where the liquidity provider steps in and pays back the bondholders. That's called a liquidity provider. The renewal of those types of products has been, for a while it was somewhat of a questionable if they would renew on unhealthy credits. That area of the business is coming back. For a good credit as yourself is, I don't see that being as much of a consideration because they don't see you as a risky investment to stand in front of that credit. But that is always a consideration, is that you will need, the renewals happen usually 3 to 5 years. They will do them as short as 1 year. But typically we would like to see our clients getting to a liquidity provider agreement for, you know, something like 2 to 3 years, so they're actually locking in it, not having to go through that process each year. On that same lines, a liquidity provider credit, when you have a variable rate transaction, your bondholders are actually, they're not only looking at your credit, but probably the primary credit they're concerned about is that liquidity provider, because they want to ensure that if something happens, they want out of the vehicle, they do not want that investment anymore, that the, you know, JP Morgan or, you know, Fifth Third or whoever you want to use as an example, that their credit is strong and they're going to have the money to give them their principal back. So that probably became a more real consideration after the Lehman bankruptcy because we saw the rating agencies take a hard and fast look at these letter of credit or liquidity providers, and they quickly moved their ratings downward. And if you have that type of credit, there's nothing you can do about it. You pay for a liquidity provider for, you know, 2 to 3 years, and their credit is not what you initially bought. It was typically, you know, in the AA category, and we saw them slip to BBBs very quickly. Counterparty is associated with a swap and a swap only. That just means the similar is that you're also concerned about your counterparty in the swap and what could happen to them. Perfect example is like a Lehman Brothers and something like that, where you typically, if they're healthy, you're receiving your payments, and they're making their payments to you and everything on time. While this is a minimal consideration, the only time that it really came to light was with Lehman. I think all of the transactions that were associated with them were successfully transferred to some other counterparty provider. But that is a consideration when looking at a synthetic transaction. Credit enhancement is when you actually need a bank to come in and provide, or an insurer, a bond insurer, which there's not many of those, to come in and be the name that the investor sees. That's very customary with a variable rate program or a variable rate term bond. That is also subject to whatever happens to their credit. The issuer has to just ebb and flow with the moves on that credit enhancements provide, their actual rating. Issuer's credit is associated with if an issuer has a variable rate product out there, obviously we don't anticipate any movements in the issuer's credit rating, but if there was to be a movement, then when you go back into the market either to refinance that debt if it's on a short-term basis or if you're remarketing on a weekly basis and something happens to your rating in a downward movement, you're going to see an increase in interest costs. With all that being said, I know there's no checks associated with a fixed rate bond issue. There's obviously some considerations for affordability and the consideration of locking in a fixed rate in a high interest rate environment and losing flexibility in the future to refinance that debt. So I think it's something to just at least have the discussion about when thinking about fixed rate is that, kind of where the interest rates are, and while we don't know where they're going, we all have some indication of right now they're likely going to go up in the future.
I think everyone can say that.
That's all I can be assured of right now is that they can't go down any further. So with that being said, I don't feel like all of these are absolutely applicable to the city. However, I felt like it was part of the process for us internally when looking at considerations and anyone's debt portfolio. This is kind of how we go through the process, and I wanted to restate that with you all so you understood what we see as important in considerations when assessing a debt portfolio. So on page 7, what we've done is actually taken into consideration the city's debt portfolio, the general obligation bonds, as well as the water and sewer bonds. And what you see in the first pie chart under general obligation bonds is the effective capital structure. So right now, the city has approximately 52% of their debt in fixed rate bonds, approximately 31% in variable rate bonds, and approximately 17% in the synthetic fixed payer swaps. So those are the ones that are synthetically fixed with a counterparty. Kind of moving over to the right is the water and sewer bonds, the effective capital structure here. The water and sewer bonds have approximately 60% of their debt in fixed rates, and approximately 40% in variable rate, which is the one variable rate bond issue that was done in 2008. On liquidity exposure, under general obligation bonds, because this is where we wanted to actually kind of dig in and think about probably the more realistic consideration is being exposed to a third-party liquidity provider. We have seen just about every single bank be hit on their credit rating, and I seriously don't know if any one of them did not get hit over the last couple of years. Some obviously harder than the others. So from a liquidity exposure perspective, in the bottom graphic, the city is exposed to approximately, and this is purely of the variable rate debt and the fixed payer swaps. So the components in the green and the red on the top. 46% is exposed to Deptford Bank, 5% is exposed to SunTrust Bank, and that 5% to SunTrust is that small synthetic fixed rate swap that Russ mentioned earlier. And then 49% of the city's debt portfolio of the variable rate synthetic fixed rate is exposed to Bank of America, and those are through the Tennessee Municipal Bond Fund. So with that being said, we thought, okay, then that's probably where we want to take into consideration how we can mitigate some risk by looking at those particular exposures that we know of. One thing we thought about when doing this is how does this work into our debt policy in terms of exposure to variable rates for what we set in the debt policies. So slide 8 takes into consideration what we call the net effective capital structure. You still see the 52% in fixed rate bonds, the 17% in the fixed payer swap. But what we've done is we've taken the variable rate piece, which was 31%, and broken it down in between the variable rate bonds, which is the unhedged and the red at 13%, and then the other 18% is what we've considered as naturally hedged. And naturally hedged meaning it's the same amount as what we have we did an estimated unreserved fund balance number with Russ and his staff of approximately $25 million at the end of fiscal year 2010. And that unreserved fund balance is obviously in a very liquid fund that's on a short-term basis. It's earning probably next to nothing. So it's similar in terms of it's in a variable rate short-term mode, as is your variable rate bonds, the naturally hedged. So it's an asset liability matching.
One of the things that I was asking Russ about, and maybe Lauren, you can speak to it too, what this looks like. How does this change with the refunding that we're in the process of doing right now, where we're taking out some variable and we're changing that? What do these percentages look like then?
Well, I'm glad you asked, and to be honest, and I should have included that, because what this is going to end up looking like now is the 52%, well, actually what we've done is we've kind of lumped the 52% and the 17%. So what you're paying a fixed rate on, beforehand it was 69%, now it's going to be 77%. And your variable rate was 31%, now it's going to be 23%. And I can add a pie chart in here and recirculate that if that's helpful.
So really the 52 goes to about 60, because
Yeah.
we're not adding any more synthetic swaps, obviously. So,
You're exactly right.
okay.
The 17% stays exactly the same, the 52% goes to 60, and the variable rate goes from 31 to 23.
Within the unhedged and naturally hedged, do you have that breakout?
Well, I would assume that you would take it off of the variable rate unhedged percentage. Because we broke this out more or less for a comparison to the debt policy.
Okay, got it.
And the unreserved fund balance was a good estimate as of fiscal year 2010.
So the 69.
And we kind of, in hindsight, maybe should have moved this to the beginning, because this is moving forward. And after we went through this whole process with Russ and kind of looking at the debt and kind of scrubbing kind of what we thought the considerations were, we thought, okay, here are some considerations in how you could modify the city's existing portfolio. GEO specifically, we did not look at the water and sewer because it's a pretty straightforward debt portfolio. Consider refunding currently callable variable rate debts that aren't associated with a swap. That would immediately reduce your variable rate exposure. As I mentioned earlier, variable rate debt is always currently callable, so there's no consideration about, can I advance refund it? And there's a very quick 30-day window. You just notify and you refund your bonds. It's a fairly straightforward process. The other consideration was refunding currently callable variable rate debt with an increased exposure to a particular credit provider or a liquidity provider. DEPSA and Bank of America are obviously where the heaviest exposure is. There's a small exposure to SunTrust. And then consideration of, reducing the exposure to the lowest of the credit ratings for the two letter of credit providers that the city has, the DEPSA and the Bank of America and SunTrust, which kind of primarily focusing on DEPSA and Bank of America since that's where the heaviest portion of the variable rate debt is. And here what we've included this nice set of crazy acronyms or whatever to the right-hand side are the short-term ratings and the long-term ratings of these particular banks. The short-term ratings are the P1s, the A2s, the 1s, and the Fs, and I tend to, kind of not get to focus on that because that's a short-term look of these banks. The credit ratings on the second part of that, which is the A3s, the AA3s, the triple Bs, those are what you more or less can relate to because the city also has a credit rating from the same rating agencies. For example, DEPSA, it has an A3 from Moody's, a triple B from S&P, and an A- from Fitch. Bank of America has a AA3 from Moody's, an A+ from both Fitch and S&P. SunTrust has an A2 from Moody's, a triple B+ from S&P, and an A- from Fitch. So based on the existing ratings for these particular letter of credit providers, we denoted that the depth of credit is obviously the weakest. So based on these considerations, that's how we selected, and if you have to probably go back to the first page that kind of gave you a snapshot of the city's debt. But the Series 6B1 2004 bonds are variable rate, currently callable, and they have exposure to DEPSA. They're currently remarketing just fine. However, we felt like now would be a good time to consider refinancing those bonds, locking them in at a fixed rate, a historically low fixed rate, and reducing the exposure to the city on interest rates, as well as a third-party credit provider. And that piece, currently there is about 10.7, I think it actually runs at maybe 10.9 million that's outstanding, or 10 point, I don't have that. We put 10.7, but I feel like that's one of the numbers that we were scrubbing, and we realized there's a little bit more outstanding. But at this point, we consider refunding all of the remaining Series 6B1 bonds along with the Series 2004 bonds, which will be an advance refunding for savings. And that was the piece that was included in the resolution that was brought to the board on Tuesday.
Okay.
So we're really saying the VB1 would be for safety, and the Series 2004 would be for savings.
Yeah, you're going fixed to fixed on that and saving the interest rate difference.
Right.
And the other, you're converting a variable into a fix, which we think long-term will give us savings. And that's when we
Right,
projected out those
right.
savings, we took a number, what was it, I think it was around 4% that we assumed, because this is a longer-term issuance, that if we look at that versus that, there's another almost $1.1 million of savings
yes.
against that sort of assumption.
To go to the fix.
And if you go back to 2006 and 2007, we were paying about 3.6% on that particular issue. It's only since the financial meltdown that the rates have gone down, down to 0.5 point.
But that's also the reason that if we can make the changes, now is a great time to make the changes.
And what you're looking at really is giving up today 0.6% and fixing the rate at about 2.5. If we wait, you take the chance of going back to 3.5 or 4%. So it seems like a very logical thing to do.
And actually, a saving of 1% on the interest rate, of 1 basis point on the interest rate would be almost a third of the interest? If you're paying 3.5? What is it?
100 basis points, not 1
Okay,
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Right.
1%.
1%, yeah, 1% out of 3.5,
It's
that's a lot of,
between the fourth and the third.
yeah, a fourth and a third there, and the interest is pretty big on all of these, since they're,
But if you take the long-run view, we're going to go back to 3.5 to 4%.
Sure.
And you can borrow now for 2.49, I think was the last rendition that we did on running the numbers, Lauren, that this overall issue is going to average out at about 248, 249,
Yes, that's correct. Based on current rates.
based on current
You're going
rates.
below
That's the urgency to this, is we wanted to go ahead and make the move on this while the market is where it
How
is.
soon are you doing this? Like,
We'll settle within 2 weeks if we can.
You gave us the authorization on Tuesday, and that's what we're moving forward
so I was
with.
just
Yeah,
wondering
within
how
2
soon
weeks.
that'll happen. Okay.
and that was one of the reasons that we went ahead and
I should have
did
sent,
that.
I should have sent this to you. Yesterday, we got reaffirmed our AAA rating from both Moody's and Standard & Poor's. So we just got that word yesterday afternoon, I think. So everything's lined up to go, so. It's good.
So, obviously, it seems that the recommendation was to go with those two first. Is there any, kind of next step planned, or do we wait and see, or what? Anybody?
I'm sorry, if the question's directed to me, I'm not sure.
Well, I guess it was directed to all of
The
you.
rest of the debt issues, how we approach this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what we would like to do, and I've talked to Lauren about this at length, what we'd like to do is set up a schedule starting in December or sometime early in next year to go ahead and start picking off these other issues and refunding those. We don't want to go to market with all of this at one time for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's harder to sell a big issue. It's easier to sell smaller issues, not tiny issues, but, the city used to do 2 million or 5 million at a time, and the issuance cost was, exorbitant as a percentage of the thing. We're trying to go in those increments between 10 and 20 million where possible. So we'd like to go back out and refund some of this, in part to lock in the fixed rate, and in part to take away some of the risk that we have with variable rate, in case there is a spike. Again, the consensus forecast is there is no spike in sight. And, you can't pick up a business journal without reading about deflation.
Right.
But the other hidden benefit of this is we would like to draw down the variable rate so that we have capacity later on, when interest rates are high, and perhaps very high, that we have capacity to go back into variable rate, which would be, if it stays on the historical average, much less expensive, because you're paying on the short end of the yield curve instead of on the high end. But right now, with rates where they are now, we really need to try to go ahead and push forward with doing this. But we wanted to pick off one or two issues at a time and be able to slowly go in and do this. The other reason is we're saving a lot of money on this, and we've run the numbers on this. Being in this third to a fourth of our portfolio in variable rate debt has saved a lot of money over the last 5 or 6 years. And particularly in the last 2 years, when we needed all the help that we could get, when revenues were plunging and interest rates were coming down on the investment side, we had the good fortune of also having the debt service go down on the liability side. So I think it's worked for us well, but this is the moment for us to plan to reduce this going forward.
Because as you've been saying, you even though there doesn't appear to be some spike in the near future, the reality is that, as has been stated, it's almost surely going to go up, since there's no room to go down.
It's like the old story, when you want to borrow money, you go to the bank when you don't need it.
Yeah.
And you can prove that you don't need it. That's when you'll get the best rate.
It's good to know that this supported our vote last night.
There's good thinking behind it.
Well, Lauren had put that together, as you know, well before, and brought you that
We know
resolution.
that.
Okay, well, that's been
Very
very informative.
Yes.
And I appreciate this, and I think it's worked well to manage it this way. Would
Good.
you say,
I
Ron?
was pretty impressed. Russ had to push me into doing it because I just wanted to come up to Franklin.
You can still come.
Drive back would still
I'll
be.
find a way to still get there, don't worry.
The other piece that we wanted to do along with this as a compliment, and we don't need to spend a whole lot more time on it, but one of the parts of our debt policy is that we would do an annual review of that policy and sort of check in. And granted, the policy is barely over a year old, but we wanted to take the opportunity now to do that as we've reviewed these issues, but also at the meeting we did the first week of July, we also did go back through and assessed and looked at where we were on all of our benchmarks. And so we really feel that the combination of that and what we just did is really a good point to have looked at and said we've done our annual review, but we want to provide you an opportunity to, if there are any other questions, we do have and gave you a copy of that debt capacity model update that we did back then. We have another copy of that. We can put it up on the screen if we want to take a moment to go back over that or any of the key findings with that. They just sort of check back in with those key benchmarks that were part of that debt policy.
Well, and since we just got this
Yeah,
right here, I don't know.
And it is the same thing you saw, I think, July 6th or 8th, or whenever we had that meeting, so.
But it just didn't, hey, with all the things we had to study here, this was not something I went back to pick up, to tell you the truth, even though it stated that. But basically, we are in the same position, or close in the same position as we were.
I think we are, and as Eric says, the ink is hardly dry on that.
Right.
We really need to let it run for a little longer to see on that, but we brought you a copy of that. If you want to go over that between now and the next Finance Committee.
Okay.
And if you have any questions.
If there's
that we
anything you
need
want to bring up,
address,
yeah, let us know.
We'll be happy to, but we did want to get on the record that, the combination of our July meeting and this meeting, that we've essentially reviewed the debt policy, because that is something that we put in that policy, that we would regularly revisit it.
It's good for us to have that discipline that we do it every year, and we're just trying to make sure you realize we've really done that collectively between these two meetings, but we can always address issues or questions you have.
Okay. If we need to just put it back on the agenda for the next time, just to say, are there any questions?
Yep.
Would that work? Okay. All right, then we're looking at item 6, from the selection of the senior underwriter for the refunding issue.
In your resolution that you passed on Tuesday, you delegated to the mayor and the city administrator the authority to make a decision on whether or not we do a competitive or negotiated sale, and if we did a negotiated sale, to select the underwriter. And while Lauren is still on the line, her team went through and issued an RFP to all of the known underwriters within the state. Remember, this is a tax exempt issue, so it has more meaning to the residents of Tennessee than it does outsiders. So we wanted to engage people that have a strong presence within the state to be involved in this. We did get 10 proposals. They came in about 40 pages each, and Lauren and her team are still reviewing all the details of that. We have prices ranging from $3.10 a bond up to $7.27 a bond. But you can't really go, this is a very small cost of the big picture, and you can't really go by cost alone. In our RFP, we asked for their experience, their activity within the state, their financial credentials, et cetera. So we'll be coming back, Lauren and I will, and her colleagues will come back with a recommendation for Eric and the mayor to make a decision on that. There was a question of whether we would get permission from the state quickly enough to be able to do a negotiated sale. You actually have to get approval to do that. And we did receive that about an hour ago, or an hour before the meeting started, which is still in time for us to make a decision to go in that direction. There's typically a little extra cost involved in doing the negotiated sale. But the advantage of that is it's a known quantity. In other words, you will negotiate based on where the market is on a given day, what you're going to pay. If you do a competitive sale, you have to set a date 2 or 3 weeks out. And, if we go to war or there's an oil spill the day before, rates may shoot up and it works against you. So typically on refundings, they are negotiated. They don't have to be, but we are probably leaning in that direction. And it depends in the final analysis of who we pick in the underwriter and the conversations that we have with them to do that. But all of the forecasts that we have run based on the market conditions over the last 2 weeks have pointed to a rate under 2.5%. So whether it's competitive or negotiated, I think we would be very pleased with that. So we don't really have a recommendation for you tonight, but we wanted you to know what the process was, that we do go through a very open process to try to identify who the best value is and give everybody a chance to get that underwriting business.
So really, at this time, it's just, we're getting more information about the process.
That's right. And as soon as we identify who that is, we'll forward that information on to you. Lauren, do I need to add anything to that?
No, I think that's a very good recap of where we are.
All righty.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren, for spending time with us tonight.
Forget I can wave at everyone. I very much enjoyed this. Thank you for your time, and thank you to Russ and his team that worked to get me up to speed technically on how this works.
Great. Thank you again.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Now we're looking at item 7, the proposed revision to certain purchasing-related provisions of the City of Franklin Municipal Code.
You get the warm seat, commonly called the hot seat.
Brian Wilcox is our purchasing manager and has looked at some opportunities to, I think, revisit some of our thresholds in terms of what we do and how we do purchasing, with an idea of still maximizing the value we get, but also improving our efficiency and getting it done. And so Brian sort of looked at it with that eye, and I'll let him sort of walk through what he is proposing and what we think might benefit us in trying to hit the right balance between those two.
Thank you, Mr. Stuckey and Madam Chairman and members of the committee. It's nice to be here. I don't get to come very often. I feel always welcome, but appreciate the opportunity to be here. As Mr. Stuckey said, we have some suggestions for you. I want to present these in the context of suggestions, not something that we feel is a must-do. This is would be a policy change, and that's clearly your purview. And these are suggestions that are now permitted under state statute, and we think might serve the city well, but we're just presenting them to you for your consideration this evening. You may wonder why, and I'm just going to summarize what it is we're presenting and then jump straight to the why we're presenting it. The quick summary of what we're presenting fall in 2 categories. One has to do with our purchasing requirements and thresholds, and the other category has to do with the other end of the life cycle of our acquisition, and that's the disposal of surplus property. And here, in this case, really talking about what the law calls personal property. It's not that it's the property of any individuals, it's the city's property, but it's personal as opposed to real property. This evening, I'm not talking about the disposal of real property or real estate.
The jails.
That's right. So in that order, the memo that you have summarizes the current thresholds for purchasing and what our proposals are. The threshold for purchasing really comes in 3 categories: under 2,500, between 2,500 and 10,000, and over 10,000. Currently, under 2,500 is where we check pricing if it seems wise, but we have no formal competitive process that's required of the individual making the purchase. Above 2,500 up to 10,000, we are required under state law to obtain 3 quotes if those 3 quotes are possible or available to obtain. And then over 10,000, the sealed bid process pursuant to public notice is required. And we're suggesting that those thresholds be changed to 10,000 and 25,000. So below 10,000, no formal procurement process required, but certainly options available to us. Over 10,000 up to 25,000, we would get the 3 quotes if possible, and above 25,000, go through the sealed bid process. On the disposal of surplus property, there are 2 thresholds currently. I'm sorry, there's really just one threshold, and that's the $4,000. Below $4,000, we have no formal obligation to pursue a competitive process for disposal of surplus property. And again, I'm talking about personal property only. And above $4,000, we have an obligation to use a sealed bid or a public auction. As you know, we've had very good success with using an electronic auction. The one that we've used in the last 5 years and more is called govdeals.com. I'll put a plug in for our surplus property on GovDeals. And we've had good success with that, and we use that even for the smallest items. Really, this threshold would be handy to change, not so much because we intend to change our process, but it would reduce the frequency that we need to publish in the newspaper. And I will tell you honestly, I don't think people who are shopping for surplus property are doing it because they saw something in the newspaper in the legal notice section. So what our proposal is on the surplus property is to change the $4,000 threshold to $10,000. Now both of these components or areas of purchasing policy are codified in the city's municipal code, and so it would require an ordinance to make a change. And we have not begun the process of preparing an ordinance. Really wanted to bring it to you for your direction before we pursue that next step, if that's your pleasure. And I would say that the Finance Department recommends that if you choose to pursue this, that we think in terms of implementing it effective at the beginning of a fiscal year. So if you choose to pursue it now, we would not implement this. We would go ahead and have the Board of Mayor and Aldermen consider the ordinance, but make it the effective date July 1 of 2011. So why are we making these suggestions? As Mr. Stuckey alluded to, partly it's procedural. We always try to get best pricing, but the process of preparing specifications and going through the publishing process and taking the time to take sealed bids and evaluate the bids and bring them to the Board of Mayor and Aldermen, it all adds up. And time is precious, and sometimes that may mean that we may not get the best pricing if there is something available now that might not be available then. I'm always a little reluctant to worry too much about a good deal. Good deals don't mean a lot to me, and I'm not advocating that the city change its rules just to take advantage of good deals. But I am suggesting that having flexibility would be another tool in our toolkit to not have to go through the process for kinds of procurements where it's it's very difficult to prepare a set of specifications. And I'll give you an example. We are right now needing to make some repairs on a roof at the eastern flank battlefield facility. And we estimate that that'll come in over $10,000. Probably not by a whole lot, but it'll be a $10,000 plus project according to Brad Wilson on our staff. And so we're going to go through the process of preparing specifications and taking bids for that, as we are required to do. But that's a project where it would be handy to have 3, maybe 4 contractors go out, look at the project, write up a quote, give us a written quote for that project to get the job done. Brad reviews them, staff reviews them. We might bring a contract to you for your approval if a contract is involved, but we would otherwise sign the deal and move ahead. And we'd be getting good pricing, and we'd verify that because we have the staff expertise to know that, yeah, that's a good price for that project. But we wouldn't be tying up your time and the staff time on the bidding process. There are times also when writing specifications and taking bids is not practical, as for example when there's just one supplier. This doesn't happen very often, but it does happen often enough, and we call those the sole source purchases. And I have been trained by the law department here at the city to look at sole source as something we want to really try to avoid. In fact, I have on my bulletin board a caption I quoted our previous city attorney, "If in doubt, bid it out." And we really tried hard to avoid the sole source situation. But there are times when we don't have much choice. And adjusting these thresholds will reduce the number of times that we need to bother you with that. An example of sole source purchasing for the city, this may or may not be under the $25,000, but meter heads for our water meter system. Once we've selected the industry and the supplier of meters, we can't be in 2010 deciding to buy meters that are from a different supplier and from a different manufacturer. And there's only one supplier for that manufacturer in our region, and so it's an example of where that's a sole source purchase. Another example would be traffic controllers for our traffic operations system. Those have to work and be compatible with the system that we have in place. On the surplus property portion of our proposal, we're recommending this really, as I mentioned before, so that we wouldn't have to publish notices quite so often. The truth is that we have a lot of property that's almost worthless by the time we're done with it. And so this adjustment won't make any difference for the vast majority of our property, but we occasionally do have items, lawnmowers or vehicles that we want to go ahead, they still have some useful life in them. We want to go ahead and replace them though, and this would make that a little easier. Again, we would plan to continue to auction those through the electronic auction. Finally, we're recommending, at least I'm recommending, and I think this is a staff recommendation, that one component of the ordinance be revised having to do with the sale of surplus property to a city employee or city officer. Right now, that is permitted, but only by sealed bid or auction, which is a pretty good policy. I am more comfortable with that than in the absence of a sealed bid or a public auction. That's something we definitely want to avoid. What I'm here to suggest this evening is, from a purchasing manager's perspective, there's no need to be doing business with a city employee or a city officer when it comes to disposal of surplus property. There are plenty of other people who would be interested in our stuff. And even if a city employee or a city officer would pay the city a little more, I don't think it's worth the risk to our integrity and the perception of having arm's length negotiations with complete people who have no relationship of any kind with the city. So I'm just advocating that we completely separate doing business with city employees and city officers and not even permit it, even under public auction or sealed bid. So in summary, these are suggestions for your consideration. We would welcome your direction and thoughts on how we should proceed. Thank you for your time.
So Brian, who reasonably anticipates the value of an item that's going to be
Surplus.
That's going to be surplus? Whose call is that? What are the checks and balances on that?
If there's any question about whether it's above or below the threshold, we'll check the value. If it's a vehicle, we'll use the Blue Book, for example. Will depend on the subject matter expert in our staff to make the best call. So in the case of vehicles, we'll use our fleet maintenance department to advise us on that. In the case of office equipment, I have tried the last several times. We haven't bought any new copy machines in several years, but when we did, I would put the old ones as trade-in, and we got a grand whopping total of $0 for the trade-ins. And so I've come to learn that there's just not a lot of market. The technology on office equipment changes so fast that it becomes, I don't want to say worthless, but it has very little value, generally speaking.
Okay.
But we'll use staff experts to determine that.
So essentially, your staff will also confirm of what the anticipated price might be in addition to what a department head or...
Certainly.
Okay.
We work with the departments to decide what the value probably will be.
And this is a good policy. Like you said, the perception for an employee to buy something that has belonged to the city, it's just not worth the city risking its reputation for something that might look suspicious. So
That's how I feel about it.
I had a couple of questions, maybe more than two, but you obviously answered part of my question. What do we sell for over $10,000? And vehicles might be one of them. Is that it? What else do we sell for over $10,000?
We had a piece of equipment, it doesn't come up very often, but we had a piece of equipment when I first came to the city. We owned a farm implement that was used once upon a time to inject the byproduct from the wastewater treatment plant, the biosolids, incorporate that into the soil.
I know what you're talking about now.
And we
Yes.
decided to stop that process and haul the sludge away. So we just were out of that business. We had no further need for that piece of equipment. That was a high dollar piece of equipment. In fact, that piece of equipment caused us to renegotiate our contract with Gov Deals because we knew that it was going to be a big item. And it brought close to $100,000, even though it was used. I mean, it was not a new piece of equipment. But that's unusual.
Yes.
But that's a good example that comes to my mind.
Well, the follow-up on that particular part of it was, how many of those, over $10,000 items do you think we have? Or else, just even how many vehicles do we sell every year?
I'm going to estimate that we sell a dozen,
Okay.
maybe a few more than that a year. It depends in part on how many we purchase.
Right.
And so lately, we've not been turning them over very much. But again, the practice of the city in the past has been to keep those vehicles until they have fairly high mileage, 60, 80, 100,000 miles. And that may be something that on another occasion we would like to revisit as to whether we might trade those vehicles out a little sooner. And so the value of vehicles in the future might be higher than the value of the vehicles that we've gotten rid of in the recent past.
I also agree about selling to interested parties that have connections to the city probably is something that you really ought not to do unless you really have that arm's length, and that would be the seal bid, but even then, I think that's difficult. On the other part, on the purchasing, I guess a part of my concern would be not pursuant to public notice. And you were just mentioning about the re-roofing the building. At this point, there might be more than 4 sets of people who are interested in something like that. So if you don't put out the public notice, then are just asking for people, 4 companies that we know about, that might keep some people who would be interested in the business and who might need the business from
Being aware of it.
Being aware of it, that's right.
One strategy that I hope to implement that may partially respond to your comment is the better use of our own website to post bid opportunities or even quote opportunities, and also allow vendors to electronically register with the city in some form or fashion. Mm-hmm. That's something that we're working on already. So we take vendor calls and mm-hmm. keep a database of right. who's interested already today. We do that now. So if there is a roofer who's called and let us know that they're interested, then we will be sure to include them, even if we have enough quotes. If they've taken the time to express interest in doing business with the city, we'll be sure to check with them. But we may be able to do a better job in the future of posting opportunities, even for informal quotes, on our city website.
And having people aware of this too, because I remember a couple of years ago, we got a very good bid on doing something at our house where we know those people wouldn't have done that, except in the circumstances that have occurred in the last year or two.
They're hungry.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So I'm taking that you mean public notice in the sense of a legal public notice that has to be mm-hmm. published in right. a newspaper of general circulation.
Exactly.
And but still, I would hate to keep somebody who might be interested, from having the knowledge about situations there.
Point well taken.
Really, and I don't know. It is also a bit of a concern. I mean, $25,000 may not be very much money these days, but that impression of not letting the public know about it also sometimes can lead to the idea, mistaken or not, that there are some people who have an in with certain people in the city, and that if it's the $10,000 which we have now, I don't know that that would be such a problem. But that is my concern about increasing that to $25,000 because, as I say, you just don't want to have that impression there, and that is a fair amount of money, in these times. I think I do appreciate your comment about having a difficult time preparing specs for some of the things. I'm sure that would take up an awful lot of time for just some specific.
And I should hasten to add that it's not just my time. It's
Oh, no.
It's the departments
Exactly.
who have the expertise in that subject matter, and then I polish them and review them and put them in final form.
I move we go ahead and proceed to developing an ordinance to support your research with the values you've given. A comment would be, I think there's always going to be the feeling that even if the number is $5,000, that maybe we're catering to people or giving them the inside, but I think that with the processes that we have in place, I think that you know and we know that we're trying to be fair to everyone. So,
Thank you.
Yes, we're looking for a second.
Second.
Okay. I do want to say, though, that even when there are great safeguards in place, there are some, well, as we well know, where, I don't know about the safeguards here, but there have been some governmental problems with not having as many effective safeguards as one thinks. And I know over the years, the city has been, cautioned about some things on that. So even as much as you try, and you certainly, we feel good about our employees, it still also is something that sometimes you don't know.
One of the things I'd suggest we may do in parallel with this, and Brian mentioned it, is there are these that adds transparency that are web-based, and vendors can self-identify themselves as interested in providing certain types of services that we maybe, as we're doing this ordinance, demonstrate to you and the public how we're moving forward with some tools that help provide and open opportunities to folks to self-identify business they want to do with us, and us to then share those back out. I have a little experience doing that where I came from, where we did that very thing, and it really did work well, and it worked well for the departments as a tool to very quickly get quotes. And there are a couple of vendors I'd like to share with Brian to make sure you're looking at some of them we're looking at that I've had some experience with before, that maybe that is a good companion to some of these adjustments that also show some enhanced process to provide these opportunities.
And in this day and age, really, the website might be a better public notice than...
The more and more that's what people are looking at going anyway.
Yes, that is true, that is true.
So in the formal public notice sealed bids, those things are always linked, that you couldn't just use public notice other than, what I'm asking is if we say, hey, we want to buy this, and if you're interested, call us without preparing the sealed bids below the sign. See what I'm getting at?
No, I think we could do kind of a hybrid like that.
That would save you time rather than having to go into the minutiae of
Soliciting
some of
quotes.
this.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's where some of these online processes work. They will automatically send out notice and provide a window for quotes. And we may have 3 or 4 we know locally that we think are really good, but the automated system will go and send them out and give them a certain period of time to respond, and then you have those also come into play, and you can compare those, and it's pretty efficient, and it's really low effort for the staff, but they can get a lot of pricing fairly quickly. And so I think that might be a way of doing it. It's public in nature, but it's not as much formal process, but it's still very open.
Right, but it's not the legal notice.
But it's not as much the legal and the publish it in the newspaper of general circulation and the time and cost involved with that.
Because always with the sealed bid process, you have to give an X amount of time for those to be responded to.
Exactly.
So you build in.
You build in weeks into your process to get it published, provide for the response, provide for the review of the response, and we can shorten that process but still have an open process.
Call the question.
Or can we just say, let's vote on it?
Yeah, so that'd be
So we don't have to vote on
great.
calling the question. All in favor, say aye.
Aye. Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now we want to look at the credit card and online payments.
Steve Sims is with us tonight to address this. This is, has some similarities in that we're looking at some of the things we already do and coming to you about how that works, but also talking about how does this apply going forward with our interaction with our customers, both in terms of credit card and closely related element to that, online payment and transactions. And I'll let Steve run with it from there.
Thank you,
Steve.
and welcome. This is very similar to the same issue before, and that is that we've had some practices in place in the past. You provided that in the package that you got. We do have accept credit cards in certain situations. We do accept online payments using cards in certain situations. Philosophically, the guidance provided to us in the past has been along the lines that we would allow the customer to pay those fees that are associated with processing credit cards. As you know, there is definitely a transaction fee, and that runs something in the 2.5%, whether you buy it at Walmart or you buy it from the city of Franklin and pay for it through a card. There's some kind of transaction fee that's passed on and has to be absorbed somewhere for processing that transaction. The question really is how do you want me to proceed in terms of passing these fees or absorbing these fees, and where do these get recognized? Online payments, the card companies have generally, I shouldn't say generally, they definitely allow us to charge the customer for the convenience of making those fees. However, when we move to a face-to-face environment, that's in those office transactions, that those transactions need to be relatively transparent to the customer, that we cannot pass on fees in a face-to-face transaction to a customer except in the case of property taxes. So that really limits your ability to be able to take cards at the counter for specific transactions. What we've got is that we went down a path several years ago. We did deploy a credit card. We do allow online payments for utility bills. We've had really quite good success. About 800 to 900 customers a month pay us online and pay the fee to the processor to do that, for the privilege of doing that. We also have that application for property taxes, but we have very limited success there. Last year, there were only 199 payments for property tax, and consistently the message we get is that I just don't want to pay the fee. The county does have some similar provisions, as do the trustee offices. So that is consistent. They're in the 2+ range. But again, these are fees, and the payer, customer has the choice to pay that or pay through an alternative method. We have deployed yard sale permits. You can actually buy a permit online and pay a convenience fee for doing that. We set that up as a model to be able to extend that to other permits and licenses that are issued by the city. So if we can do that in that case, we can also do it in other similar situations. They do a registration, pay it, and pay that. But that has also had limited success. The fee is $5. The yard sale permit is $5. Well, the processing fee is $3. And so many people say, well, I'll just come in and do it. Now, personally, I don't understand loading up everybody in the SUV, spending the gas and time to come in for $3. But that's their choice. And that's what we want to do, is offer customer choices in terms of how they pay. So the question before y'all, and what I'm trying to do is the guidance, again, as in the past has been, is that we want this, but we want the customers to pay that. So if we follow that practice, that really limits how much we can extend our credit card use across the city. because we can't do it at the counter. It would be my recommendation that what we end up doing is look at actually absorbing the fees. Now, I know that we never absorb the fees because ultimately the customer is going to pay for that. But in those cases which are more like a business, if you will, and those are cases where they are our utility service business, that they can make card payments at the counter. But if we did that, we would have to incorporate the fee and pass it on, and that'd be part of our operating costs. Court fees and fines. Clearly, if we've got somebody in front of us, we want the money right then. And we don't want them to walk out.
That's a little bit different from paying for your water bill, right?
Yes, ma'am. We don't want them to walk out the door and hand us an IOU and say, "I'll catch you later," because there's additional costs and all in the follow-up process in order to do that. So that would be another case. Routine permits and licenses. It would be easy enough to build a fee structure, another buck or two or whatever the number is, in order to be able to say, yeah, that'll cover our transaction fees in order to do that for those kinds of permits and licenses that we get. So those are the kinds of things. When you look at even things like parks and recreation, Lisa's had requests out there to be able to pay on a credit card. Our whole BNS shop, they consistently get requests to be able to pay for credit card. Now, when you look at that, there's also the limit, the cap. It's one thing for somebody to pay a $100 utility service bill. It's another thing for a business to pay a $100,000 utility service fee or a $500,000 tap fee. We would not envision going to that extreme, that it would be limited in that regard. But that's got to be pursued. We've talked to some of the financial institutions, and it's unclear as to whether or not we can segment our customers in that way to be able to say, well, you can pay with a card, but you cannot because you're a business, you're a resident. So we've got to go through some of those kinds of things. But again, it's just, do we want to, absorb those fees or continue the status quo?
One of the things I'd add in is when you think about it, there's a cost to any transaction, whether it's accepting cash, accepting a check, or accepting a credit card. And I think as we look at this, and I think Steve might confirm this as well, the costs are driving close enough down for the credit cards that it might be worth looking at to say, is the added convenience to our customer, the added ability to collect it in different ways, online, any time of the day, the efficiency that gives us worth some of the trade-offs of those costs. And maybe it's worth going out and getting an RFP about what the options are for that cost structure, apply it to our operations and see how close are we to getting that and fitting that in, and so that the trade-off of those fees and how we might absorb those compared to the other alternatives our customers have for paying us and the costs associated with those transactions. And so I think that's really what we're interested in looking at, is going out at least to see what the market would deliver to us for those kind of transactions and what that might look like. It doesn't necessarily mean we have to decide that tonight, but is there enough interest to go out and see what that might look like and come back to you and say, here's the kind of fee structures we think we can get and how that works for us in our operations.
In talking about fee structures, it looks as if on some things there's just a flat rate, but it doesn't say it's 3% on the property tax? 3% of the transaction? There's a lot of money on property tax. I mean, because that's generally a very large sum of money. But so I'm not quite sure I understand where are the ones that you just have a flat fee and where are the ones that you have a percentage of the transaction?
Well, in this particular case, what we've got right now is a variable rate for the property tax. Again, because if going into the other part of this is how are these fees built and what are charged for fees. There is, in the transaction cost, there's in effect a flat fee as a portion of that, so much per transaction. But then there's a variable component which is a function of the value of the transaction being conducted. And so when we went out and built this before, we wanted some ability to be able to control our exposure. So what we did was, and the exposure of the customer, by building that in a flat value fee on a percentage basis.
But I'd like to get some more information about that as our study of what.
I think, is that what the RFP would be? It gives us
Yes.
more information, so then we could make
Yes.
an educated judgment.
It all depends about what kind of a transaction is it. What is, if you buy one kind of thing at Walmart and charge it on your credit card, there's a certain kind of fee associated with it. If you buy another thing at Walmart, there's a different fee structure associated with it. That gets into an accounting opportunity relative to try to balance that every month when you try to go through these efforts, which is, again, the merchant card versus a third-party processor discussion.
That reminds me of something else. What about, as I understand it, you're talking about people paying with a credit card online. Is that the same thing as having a wire transfer from your bank?
Not exactly, no, ma'am.
I wondered about that.
That's a different kind of, we've made significant success in being able to process payments electronically. Right now, three-fourths of our payments that we receive, out of the 300,000, three-fourths of them are actually processed electronically. So we've made a lot of progress, but it's still other opportunities exist out there. And our customers are telling us they want to take advantage of these things. They want to be able to do this. The fee component is a stumbling block. There's also questions about bill presentment, electronic bill presentment. They're telling us consistently they want to be able to get their bills electronically, hook into the payment side, make those payments. And if you go down that path, then how do you set those all in motion in order to be able to have, those fees? Some institutions pass the fees on, some absorb the fees, which ultimately are going to be passed on anyway, because the customer must pay for it at some point.
But it gets charged back to that customer, or do you think it gets charged to their entire customer base?
When you look at what it costs us to be able to run the shop, as Mr. Stuckey said, is that there is a significant cost associated with having a person sit there and be able to process payments. Now, people don't tend to think of that so much as a cost of transactions, but it clearly is a cost of transactions. And when you're sitting there and you're looking at by the time you include benefits now, you're probably in a $40,000-$45,000 a year range for one of our customer service reps in order to be able to be there, just for one person.
But then again, if it's somebody that walks in face-to-face and wants to pay with a credit card, you still got to have your person.
You still got to have the person.
Yeah.
So, but that's what we're trying to figure out.
So that's the reason we're saying,
Take a look at it, bring us
take a look at
something.
it.
And we like to cast it pretty wide to look at all of our variety of transactions so that we can kind of see how this might help us do a better job serving the citizens.
If it costs us too much money, don't bring it back.
The risk in that if we act as our own merchant, than if it's a bogus card.
If it's that's a whole set of serious, because if you act as your own merchant, what happens is that's been in the variable fee discussion, and you have costs that are more variable. You also have a lot of different transactions that you're processing, and there's an account reconciliation burden that gets borne by your finance staff in order to do that. And then the other thing is, and this is an important piece, is currently our provider, we get the monies the following day. So transactions that were being conducted today on the internet are in our bank account tomorrow. All right? If you're your own merchant, it may take a week before you ever get recognition that those are done. Again, these are reconciliation challenges that we face. And if that card is dishonored, then you've got to go through and try to figure out where it is and all of that. So there's definitely, I would not recommend acting as our own merchant. There's a lot of hidden burdens in that path.
We're trying to streamline, not burden.
Yes, sir. We want to do that. What we'll be moving toward is to be able to build, just to understand what those fees are. But it's easy enough to figure out. When we look at an average bill, utility bill is $60-70 a month, on a residential side, and how many can you get? And so you're really talking about relatively speaking, not a significant amount of money. Court fees and fines definitely make sense to be able to have those in, absorb those too, because you can bill those into your court costs.
Right. And you do have you have them there then on your court costs, as
Yes, ma'am.
opposed to having any other hold on them other than some more further legal action, right?
We probably get a fourth of the ones that show up give us an IOU.
Really.
Well, then, are we just kind of going to
So
say
then the motion just needs-
Let's proceed.
that we're interested in getting further information?
And we'll proceed with doing an RFP
Right.
that looks at these transactions and broadens the application, and then we can come back and bring some proposals to you there. Does that sound, Steve, does that cover what we need direction on?
Yes, sir.
I'm too excited.
I don't see the enthusiasm when you arrive, Steve.
Well, yes, I will develop an RFP and bring it back for your consideration.
Well, I think we want the response to the RFP to come back. We don't need to bring the RFP to this committee. We'll develop the RFP and then send it out, get the responses, and then come back.
Or are you asking us to make one of these choices? Is that your intent tonight?
The valuation, when we have multiple options for presentment, the bid evaluation process would be extremely challenging. That's the developing the RFP and said you can do it this way or that way and all that is not particularly difficult, but the valuation consideration on how that might go in some kind of objective manner may be more difficult.
Okay.
I think the direction I would like to pass is that something that streamlines city operations and saves us money would be what I would be looking
Or
for.
it doesn't cost us too much, right?
Or has minimal cost to us. That's what I'm looking for. So, and modernize us to a point where people can be doing things other than running a credit card and waiting for the response and authorization.
And like you've covered tonight, there are some things that have no appeal to the public. So those things that have no appeal, is there value in excluding those in the consideration of the RFP?
Okay.
You see?
I can do that.
And I think we've discussed a number of these issues for consideration. I think we can kind of formulate around those and come back to you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and narrow that down.
Thank you.
Any more to
right.
talk about? Okay. Thank you very much.